My name is Jonathan Boulware. I'm the Executive Director of the South Street Seaport Museum in New York City, located in the original port of the city of New York. I came to this role in somewhat of an unusual way. The background that I have is one of sailing ships, so the kinds of ships that we have here are where I spent 20 years of my life as a deckhand, as a mate, as a captain, as a program director. And in working in these ships, it gave me a powerful belief that the kinds of experiences that we do here at the South Street Seaport Museum, namely experiences that allow people to touch and interact with history by going sailing, by working with print shops, that these experiences are more powerful and more connecting in terms of how people relate to the city of New York, to the history of the city of New York, and to the present and future of this place. I grew up near the Mystic Seaport Museum in Mystic, Connecticut. My dad, when I was a kid, was the head rigger, so he was responsible for the maintenance of the rigging of these historic ships in Mystic. So when I grew up there, I learned to sail in the Mystic River in traditional little boats that were, tiny versions of the kinds of big ships that we have out here. I'm told that I first went sailing when I was just a few days old. My dad worked at the Mystic Seaport Museum, and the boats that were there, they used to take these little boats out and go sailing out into Fisher's Island Sound. And I'm told that within a few days of being born, my mom and dad and a few friends had me out in a boat and out in Fisher's Island Sound. Obviously don't remember that, but it's hard to say, how much that or other experiences like that influence where I am today. So it was actually, so the decision for me to go to sea was frankly really an impulse. I had been steeped in maritime tradition and had access to boats and really traditional boats, wooden boats with kind of natural fiber rigging, kind of stuff that's a little bit of a different feel from what people generally have access to. And I ended up just doing a piece of work in a boatyard, and as I was in that boatyard in Bridgeport, Connecticut, preparing a little yacht for a trip up to Maine, there was a ship there, this HMS Rose, this replica British frigate, and they were making ready to go to Puerto Rico. They were going to the islands, and I went over there at every little break I had from the boat that I was working on. We had probably close to 2 weeks that we were in this yard preparing this boat, and I would go over at every break. Every time we stopped doing what we were doing, I'd go over and watch these guys. They were sending sails up into the rigging, sending yards aloft, and people were climbing up and just preparing the ship. It was a hive of activity. Boxes and crates going aboard, and unnecessary things going off, and new people going aboard with their sea bags, and I was fascinated. And I got a tour, and I talked to the people, and I asked several times about the possibility of joining the ship, and was told by the mate each time, there's no room, we're all set, kid, bug off. And I persisted, and it got to the point where during my breaks from my other job, I was coming over and volunteering just to get my hands on things. And finally, I was taken by the third mate, and he said, all right, well, let's see if you can climb aloft without getting scared. And so they put me into, I'm not even sure they put me into a safety harness, frankly, but up I went, and 60, 70 feet above the deck, and there I was, and I was certainly, sweaty palms and worried, but I wasn't going to show it. And I got back down to the deck, and I left the ship to go back to do what I was doing. The next time I came back to the ship, the captain was there, and he said, all right, you want to go with us? And I said, yes. And he said, great, pack your sea bag and be back here in 36 hours. We leave for New York. I don't think it's possible to ever properly anticipate your first voyage at sea. Movies don't depict it. Books can depict it, but really only for people who've already seen it. It is a singular experience with endless variety. But I think I was interested in the concept of the adventure. I was certainly interested in going to the Caribbean. That's a storied place, so that was very exciting. But I certainly had no concept of what it would be like to be at sea. And here are some differences between what I thought and what it was. I think people think of being at sea as sort of, there's a concept of a boat trip, and you imagine moving along, and you imagine eating meals, and you imagine sleeping, but what you don't imagine is all the motion. You don't imagine all the work. You don't imagine the lack of sleep. You don't imagine the close quarters with other people. You don't imagine the smells of diesel fuel or of a leaky marine sanitation device ahead, a toilet. You don't imagine what it's to be like to lie in your bunk and hear somebody vomiting adjacent to you because they're seasick. But you also you totally underestimate the sunrise and the sunset and the view of stars from sea, which are probably the only place I've ever seen stars as bright as I've seen at sea is in the middle of Montana with no lights around. It is a lightless environment. And so there are 1,000 things that are different But I think the other thing that is impossible to see before you get out there is that a lot of being at sea is drudgery, it's routine, it's boredom. And when it isn't, it's either because something has gone wrong or you're facing some major challenge. But at 19, having graduated high school and spent some time at university, I went to sea in a ship called HMS Rose, a replica wooden British frigate, a replica of HMS Rose herself, Napoleonic Wars era British frigate. And on that trip, the first trip, in April of 1992, we left Bridgeport, landed first here at South Street, tying up at Pier 16 while we waited for weather. Now, April in the North Atlantic is no joke, and picking a time to leave, we were headed from New York, from Bridgeport via New York to San Juan, Puerto Rico. And in picking the weather, we ended up leaving New York a little later than we'd anticipated, and we ended up in North Atlantic gale, meaning very, very powerful winds, very big seas. And rather than making Puerto Rico, because we were leaking so badly and had a number of breakages in the sailing rig, we made St. George's in Bermuda for repairs, and then made a successful trip to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I ended up staying on the ship back up the Atlantic coast via places like Savannah, which is probably just as magical today as it was then. That experience cemented for me that what I was talking about, that these experiences are powerful in ways that are challenging to describe, but when one goes through them, they're life-altering. And in my case, that was being miserable and terrified. It was being terrified of the power and the arbitrary maliciousness of the sea, of being in cold, mountainous seas in a gale in the North Atlantic at 19 years old, and just being terrified and having to go up aloft into the sailing rig to handle sail. So climbing up on a mast that's swaying from side to side, and being up there with a group of people, all of whom knew more than I did about what they were doing, but who weren't going to take my inexperience as any sort of excuse for me to do any less than my portion of the work. And that experience, and perhaps that one's a little more galvanizing, a little more dramatic than some of the others that it's possible to have in a ship like that. But regardless of whether it is really life-threatening, which mine may have only seemed to be to me, or whether it really is just the experience of being in a dynamic environment that you have no context for, with a group of people who are working toward the same goal. These experiences are very, very powerful. They're life-altering. A moment that will always remain in my mind during that first trip was being sent aloft on the foremast to, we were striking the fore topgallant, which is the top sail on the foremast, so way up in the rig. That means the wind had come up and it was time to take in this sail. And so I was sent aloft, and the ship was rolling, probably 30, 40 degrees to each side, really dramatic motion. And I went aloft on the fore, and I got up on the shrouds to the point where you step out onto the yard arm, and you see these sailors go out on the horizontal pieces, the yards. And as I went to go step out on the foot rope, I just choked. I just grabbed the shrouds, and I didn't want to do it. And the guy behind me had one foot on the foot rope and one foot on the rattlin where you're on the shrouds. And I went to go step across, and I just froze. And the guy behind me kind of put his shoulder into me and said, "Come on, let's go." And I said, "I can't." And he said, "I can't isn't part of your vocabulary." And he gave me a shove, a really tough one, that scared me and kind of just nudged me out onto the yard. And I grabbed it and I went out and I did my work and I came down. And from that moment of "I can't" and "that's not part of your vocabulary" going forward, that was a transitional moment for me in that trip and in my life. I think the captain of my ship then was a hard-driving guy, and he ran the ship like an old school captain. But I learned a lot from him and from people that I sailed with afterward. But I think the people who pick an experience like this, those who can't really adapt to the life wash out pretty quickly, and those that remain are people that they're part of the band of brothers, and of both genders, of course, here, but there's a rarefied group of people who can tolerate that kind of environment, and a smaller group still that seek it, and those are my people. My dad was supportive. There's one funny little vignette in this, which is that this is when we wrote letters to each other, right? There were no cell phones, there was no email. I could sometimes go down to the payphone and ring home, but it was easier to write a letter. It wasn't easy access to the telephone. So I wrote a letter a few days before the ship left Bridgeport, or maybe New York. I think I'd left it from New York. I wrote a note home saying I had some misgivings. I was uncertain. And I got a letter back, so the ship's mail comes to the ship's office and then it gets dispatched to wherever the ship is. So when I got to Puerto Rico, having been on this voyage that was transformational, that was terrifying, and in which the ship went through some tough times, I got a letter at the other end of that from my dad that arrived after the trip that said, if you've got misgivings about this, get off. And to this day, I still enjoy the comedy of getting that letter that if I had gotten in New York, I might have made a different decision. But I'm sure glad I did then. But the Caribbean still is a pretty magical place, particularly if you're arriving by sailing ship. There still are some really untouched places. But there are places in the Caribbean that still remain magical. And what you picture of the kind of crescent sandy beach with the palms overhanging it and the aqua clear water is still there and still magnificent. Into a little island off the east coast of Puerto Rico called Culebra, and it has a little tiny bay going into it. And so you can go in and anchor in the middle of this bay, and it's almost perfectly round, and you anchor right in the middle of that. And if you go ashore there to the other side of this tiny little island, there's one of these beaches, these crescent beaches with the palms overhanging it that people try to mimic in the tourist brochures, but you ever get to that place, it doesn't look like that. Well, this place looks like that. I ended up joining some schooners, actually very similar types of schooners to the ones we have here, that sail in Maine as passenger schooners, and worked in the Maine schooner fleet for a season as a mate, as a licensed mate, and then had my first command in the Delaware Bay on a wooden schooner. But the thread through all of this in these ship experiences has been that they've all been education vessels. They've all been vessels that in one way or another had students or participants aboard. And sometimes that's a group of passengers, as with the main fleet, where they're partly participants and partly passengers. But other experiences include taking high school students to sea for 2 days, 5 days, 3 weeks, for extended periods of time. It also includes one program that I worked in for a year that was adjudicated youth, and these kids were at sea rather than in prison. So they were spending anywhere from 4 to 10 months with us on a schooner, and that was probably the hardest and also my favorite of my experiences in working with kids at sea. Well, I think that there's a natural progression of being a deckhand, and then an able seaman, and then a mate, and then a captain, and I went through that process. And when the opportunity came for me to sail a schooner, the first thing I did was to call my dad and say, hey, am I ready for this? And he said, yeah. Are you scared of it? And I said, yeah. And he said, good. You're probably ready then. And so, he gave me a little coaching, including some practice in docking a schooner, and then I went and took that job and worked there for part of that first season, and then the next season got a full-time command, which I held on to for almost 7 years. Well, a schooner is a particular type of sailing rig, so it describes the way the masts are arranged and the way the sails are arranged, but it also, at least in the existent fleet right now in the world, it implies a certain size. So these are smaller vessels. They're 60, 80, 100, 120 feet. There's a lot to learn in being a captain, and it's something that I think if I were still doing it actively, it's something I'd still be learning about. It is a very challenging leadership environment, and one in which that's also shifted a lot over the years. The concept of the captain as the absolute arbiter of everything has dissolved, and there still is total responsibility, but the concept of total authority has shifted a little bit. And now captains, as with pilots in aircraft and captains on ocean-going ships, all of them involve their senior leadership, their mates and their engineers in decisions in ways that didn't used to happen. And that's increased safety, but it also creates a more of a team environment in which people are relying on each other. But certainly, I'm a part of a generation of people who have shifted away, and we referred to it at the time, which makes sort of political sense in hindsight, as the kinder, gentler captains. The kinder, gentler captains were the ones who were, working kind of a little bit more at creating a happy ship, and rather than the older school version, which is you make the ship run, and if people can't do their jobs, off they go. A lot of the questions that I'm asked in terms of people who are looking at being a captain are similar to the ones that I was asking, which are questions like, am I ready for this? And ready for this depends on the thing. I mean, a person can be ready for a command in one set of circumstances and not ready in another. Even in the age of all of this technological advancement and regulatory requirements for training and standards across the board for the ways in which captains become captains, there is still a sense that the human senses that we bring to this, that our innate humanness provides something material to the capacity to be able to do something as complex as navigate a ship at sea. California, I spent nearly 7 years working as a captain and subsequently as a staff director at an organization called Sound Waters in Stamford, Connecticut. So they had a little 80-foot schooner, a steel boat that was very utilitarian, very simply laid out, built for passenger trade, but they did an outstanding education program, a very successful, sought-after education program today. So hundreds of trips a year carrying students, second graders through high school students and even university students, plus the public, out onto Long Island Sound with in an effort to reintroduce people to Long Island Sound, to show them what lives on the bottom of it, to talk about the estuary and estuarine ecology and the importance of Long Island Sound and similar bodies of water to the broader environment and therefore to the human environment. And that particular organization, which was founded in the late 80s by a visionary local businessman who saw Clearwater up on the Hudson River as an example of something that was being done well, and so this was sort of a spin-off of Clearwater. And Soundwater started that in Long Island Sound, and it was a very, very successful program. So I was given a lot of great opportunities there. I spent all of the 7 years that I was there as a captain, but I also started as a staff director and running education programs as well, and part of the leadership team of the organization. So that I think was one of the places in which I began to see that there was work that I could do that was really satisfying, and this is in around the year 2000, that would lead directly to where I am right now. That there's an administrative and leadership role that supports the kind of programs that I believe so much in. That's very, very satisfying for me.
So again, all right. So you're in this position. What comes next? You're up in Connecticut.
Right. So after leaving Sound Waters, I went back to sailing vessels. So my highest goal in
And what boat was that?
1995 was to get a 500-ton ocean mate and be the mate in a boat called Tollymore. And instead, in 2004, I got a 500-ton ocean master license and was the captain. A big steel schooner, 3-masted schooner, purpose-built, ocean-going schooner.
And where were your journeys on it?
Southern California waters, Pacific Ocean. Right. So after leaving Sound Waters, I went back to sailing vessels, this one in Southern California, among others, and then launched my own business as a consultant, doing everything from shipyard project management to organizational development and staff training and program design, including consulting for some of the organizations that I worked for in the past.
What had you then make this new transition to decide to run a private consulting business?
It was time to start a family. Yeah. So spending less time afloat and more time ashore made a lot of sense, and so I started this consultancy business doing shipyard project management, organizational development, staff training, program design. There was challenge in that, but also opportunity, and it went really well. What I missed in doing that was working in an environment with a big team and a lot of people working toward the same goal. That was a lot of working independently and occasionally plugging in with other teams. Well, I was happily minding my own business in a consultancy situation when the Seaport Museum, sort of the Museum of the City of New York takeover of the Seaport Museum was beginning to happen, and through connections that I had at Mystic Seaport Museum, I was introduced to the president of the Museum of the City of New York, and inside of about 2 weeks from the initial conversation to the time that I started, I went from being in my own business to being the waterfront director of the Seaport Museum. That was in November of 2011. The Museum of the City of New York needed somebody to come in and manage the fleet of ships. I came here in 1992 before my first ocean passage. We left on that trip in the North Atlantic in April of '92 from the Seaport Museum. Two names that leap to mind as ones who were influential in my life and or made possible what I'm doing right now are, number one, Irving Johnson, who made the video in The Bark Peking sailing around Cape Horn, which is really the only and singular kind of footage of its type, and who chronicled the end of the age of sail, and who also initiated the modern era of using sailing ships as teaching tools, and who circumnavigated the globe numerous times with students aboard vessels of his own. So Irving Johnson is one, and the second is Carl Cordam, who was a leading preservationist of ships, and without whom many of the world's existing sailing ships would not be in existence. I was fully aware of what I was getting into with this fleet of ships, and I think we were on a very strong track to move the fleet and the museum forward when Sandy hit. So we had been watching Sandy, as we do all hurricanes during this time of year, and we knew that Sandy was a risk. And I, from my background as a captain and through other relationships, so we've been watching Sandy really since it was in the Eastern Atlantic. In a hurricane situation on the waterfront, what we're concerned about principally is wind, waves, and high water. So when we're thinking about preparations, we're thinking about adding additional dock lines. We're thinking about adding them in ways that allow for greater ranges of tide, both high and low. We're thinking about securing things from wind damage. That makes sure, meaning making sure that the things up in the rigging are secure, that loose things and doors and all the sorts of things on the ship that might move. So it's a very broad preparation. And so there was a lot of preparation to do. And in fact, once we got to Saturday morning, so remember that Sandy made landfall on Monday afternoon, by Saturday morning we had an army of volunteers down here. Really, really helpful to this was that I have a friend who's a climate change scientist and a specialist in sea level rise and storm surge, and I have a friend at the Ocean Prediction Center at NOAA, both of whom were able to help me interpret the predictions for how much the tide was going to rise here in Lower Manhattan. At the time we finally made our final set of dock line determinations, settled on 12 feet. 12 feet was the best number that we could come up with, 12 feet above a normal high tide. And as it turned out, what we had at the battery was 13.88 feet. So it was more than we predicted, but within a margin of error that was close enough that we were able to do it. So in the end, despite the damage that Sandy wrought on the upland side of the museum, on the fleet side, it was a huge success. It was a huge success in preparation, it was a huge success in prediction, and it was a massive success in really an army of volunteers and staff and committed people who care about the Seaport Museum's fleet, who came in and helped to prepare for that. At some point, once all that's done, there's nothing else you can do. Remarkably, there was minimal damage. We did have a little bit of damage, but it was so minimal compared to what it could have been. Our preparations were good, they were appropriate, and it worked. Well, the road for the Seaport Museum since Sandy has been a challenging one. And, it's important to note for the Seaport Museum that Sandy is the most recent and the most vivid, impactful happening in its history, and it was huge, it was devastating. But it's also important to remember that on 9/11/2001, the Seaport Museum was also severely impacted. There were no visitors to the Seaport Museum for almost 2 years following 9/11. And so by 2003, the Seaport Museum had begun to find its footing again. By 2005, it was back up and operating and had a real budget again. It had overcome a lot of hurdles. There were a variety of reasons, including a major economic, external economic impact, a market-driven impact of the Seaport Museum that led to its troubles in the later 2000s. But it's important to remember that Sandy isn't the only thing. Within 15 years, there were 2 major blows to the same institution. And that we've even got our heads above water at this point is really laudable. And that's the work of a lot of people that have made that happen, and no small part the city of New York that has stepped in twice to help this institution. Well, Sandy was the precipitating reason that the Museum of the City of New York needed to pull up stakes and focus on their own institution uptown. It seemed untenable for them to continue to do this and also preserve their own institution. And so wisely and defensively, they focused there. We, though, didn't stop our work here. And at that point, I was named interim president of the museum and this is in the middle of 2013, and began to work right away with the city and with elected officials and with the membership and the constituency of the museum to start to look for what is the next.
Well,
I have been in here for almost 2 years at this point, and I mean, as anyone who's heard me talk at any moment knows, I'm a very, very passionate guy about this museum and this place, the Seaport. So, you know, I was the most fervent and excited and you know, dogged guy on site. So I agreed to take the interim president role at the same time an interim board was named, and really as an effort to try to keep the museum going long enough that we had a viable plan. But it didn't take long for that to turn into a real commitment and desire on my part to lead this institution into its next phase. And really that leads to, you know, directly to 2015, where I took the job early this spring as full-time director. I both had a vision in mind when I took over as interim president, and I have one now that is an iterated version of that. It's been modified through experience and more contact and more time in this role. But ultimately, the vision for the Seaport Museum is one that addresses some of the structural issues that have plagued the museum for years, while at the same time playing to the museum's greatest strengths. The museum has, in its history, been strongest and most successful and most respected and has won most awards for one principal part of its activities, and that is education and programming. That means school groups, it means people who come to the museum. So as distinct from an organization or a museum that focuses principally on a robust offering of rotating exhibitions where the objects and the curation of those objects is the foremost focus, the Seaport Museum is different from that model in two ways. One, education and programming is the core of what we do, and our collections and exhibitions, our ships, our buildings, the district itself form the legs of the stool that support that core mission. And two, we do one thing that's dramatically different from other museums in the city of New York, and in fact, other than other museums worldwide. It's a tactile place. It's a place where both out on the street of ships, and that's the easy one, but also up here in the district, people can touch and interact with history in a way that is not simply looking at something behind a plexiglass box and reading a sign about it, but actually interacting with it. Probably the best example of that is our schooner Pioneer. She's an artifact. She's an 1885 schooner, and she's been working for her living as a working boat, first carrying sand and now passengers, for 130 years. We are, as of right now, it is the latter half of 2015, we are in virtually every program category 3 times larger than we were at the same time last year. So our programmatic growth, this is school programs, district walking tours, Pioneer education school programs, we are growing these dramatically. It's something we do well, it's in demand, and it's solid, tied into curriculum programming. It's STEM topics, it's history topics that we do very, very well, and that are actually challenging to do in a traditional classroom. Well, the current situation for the museum is still a post-Sandy era from the standpoint of full access to our spaces. So our galleries at Schermerhorn Row are still limited in access. We do have access and programming in them, but they are not fully accessible from the standpoint of elevators and escalators. We still don't have climate control in those galleries. So there's more work yet to be done. We did just get a great FEMA award, and that will go a long way towards starting some of these things.
Talk about what seems to be one of your particular projects of great interest, both personally in terms of its impact, the restoration of the Waver Tree.
Waver Tree is an 1885 ship. Ship meaning that she has 3 masts, and all of them have square sails on them. So a ship as distinct from a bark or a barkentine. So she's an 1885 ship, and she was just another wrought iron sailing ship, one of many. But now, she's special. She's special because she's one of the last of her kind. She's special because she called at New York. So when we talk about the street of ships, and when we look at the images, the lithographs of the street of ships here at South Street Seaport, the port of New York, the original World Trade Center of New York, ships like Waver Tree are the ones that built New York. Built it economically, built it culturally, built it in terms of the immigrant story. And so the story here at the Seaport Museum is one told in part by the Waver Tree, while she was nothing special the day she was built, is a rare, unique, precious artifact now because she's one of the last of her kind. We know that she called here in New York. We know that she is the kind of ship that would have been here any day of the week. She had my attention right from the beginning in that she's a 130-year-old riveted wrought iron ship. But as I have spent more time here, I've certainly fallen in love with her more. And the rationale for why she is our crown jewel, why she's the special one of the fleet, in terms of the larger vessels, is clear as a bell. I mean, she's the kind of ship that built New York. And the reason that we have a $10.6 million city-funded capital project going on in Wavertree right now is evidence that the Seaport Museum has effectively made the case, and the city has effectively endorsed the case, that this is the ship to tell the story of the early foundations of New York. These ships require a great deal of money to maintain. When they were in service, these ships were maintained by their sailing crews when they were underway, and they were maintained by shipyards between trips. But during all that time, there was a massive economic engine being able to pay for the repairs and the maintenance for the ship, and that economic engine was the cargo. So when you look inside Wavertree now, you see a vast cavernous space, a huge open void. That void is why she exists. It's where jute was put, it's where cotton was put, it's where coffee and tea and countless other trade goods were put. And they were bought at a low price somewhere and sold at a higher price somewhere else. And that difference paid the crew, made some profit for the owners, and maintained the ship. Right now, these ships, sitting as exhibition artifacts in the East River, are subject to the same kind of wear and tear from salt water and sun and tidal changes and rain and snow as the ships that sail the seas, but without the economic engine to drive them. So a project like the city capital project that we're underway right now is necessary. A massive influx of funds to stabilize and preserve the ship. And the work is currently being done at Cadell Dry Dock in Staten Island, one of the last great shipyards of New York, and in fact really of the Northeast. A shipyard that up until not long ago actually had gangs of people who could put rivets into ships. So what we're doing now is replacing some hull plates. We're completely replacing the main deck, which will keep the water out. We're completely replacing the tween deck, which is the deck below the main deck, which will provide us additional exhibit, classroom, and workspace. And we're doing a whole bunch of work in the rigging. What we've undertaken here is a ship preservation project of a scale and of a type that has not been undertaken in our lifetimes. The current scope of work for Wavertree will wrap up in the middle of 2016, and we anticipate her returning back to Pier 16 at that point. There will still be more work to be done. It's likely that her rigging will not be entirely complete at that point, but those are things we can do here. When we finish this, we will begin work on the other aspects of the project that we weren't able to touch. So it's an ongoing process, and it is one that we will have taken a massive step forward that will give us a foundation to do all of this future work. And Wavertree's role when she gets back to the Seaport Museum will be to be the centerpiece, the crown jewel of the fleet. And what I hope is that within, let's say, a year and a half to 2 years' time, you will be able to walk down to Pier 16 and you will see all of her upper rigging in place, you will see sails set, you will see flags flying in the breeze, and you will see a group of people aloft in the rigging working on the ship, with groups of visitors going aboard, touring the ship, going down into the tween deck, seeing the exhibitions there, participating in classes, learning trade skills. And this is everything from tourist visits to school visits to apprenticeship programs to job training programs. She will become a hub of activity at the center of our waterfronts. But the core of the vision for the museum going forward is a rationalization of the fleet, focusing on Wavertree and getting Ambrose and Pioneer and Letty Howard and W.O. Decker active again. Most of those boats are active now. We've got some more work to do on a few of them. Having that waterfront be a cohesive unit where people can go out and do programming, they can go out and go sailing or take a harbor tour. And on the land side, a group of buildings with visual access to the pier in Schermerhorn Row and on Water Street in our print shops, where again people are able to interact with history. So we've got the print shops on Water Street, we've got education and public programming and exhibition spaces in Schermerhorn Row, and we've got Pier 16 with the fleet of ships, the street of ships. There's a significant number to generate for us to be able to really bring spaces back online and to realign the museum in the ways that I've just described. Ongoingly, the Seaport Museum has been successful in the past as an education institution with fee-for-service programs. So I'm optimistic with a combination of earned income, fee-for-service education programs, and then standard philanthropy, the individual, corporate, and government giving, that we're going to be able to make a reasonable budget that will carry the museum forward sustainably.
Is there
three important pieces for the museum going forward, three things that will make a great difference in the museum's success are: one, a careful rationalization of the fleet and bringing an appropriately sized and appropriately curated group of ships up to very good condition, rather than having a large fleet of ships in poorer condition. So that's one. Two, spaces that are realigned and with access that is more suited to the kinds of programming that we do best, namely the education and public programming that we're talking about. And three, additional berthing spaces near the museum for visiting ships. The visiting ship program, and I made reference to this when I came here in 1992, 23 years ago, I was one of the crew who sailed in on a visiting ship. I might not be here as director right now if there weren't a visiting ship program then. The visiting ship program is a central and important piece of the mission going forward. So those are really the three. If at some point I'm handing this off to someone, my sincere hope, and to the extent that anything keeps me awake at night, it's this. My sincere hope is that I get to hand this off to someone in really solvent condition, with the fleet and the buildings and the programs in the condition that I've just described.
Your son is fairly young. If your son reaches the point, when he reaches the point, he's 17 or 18, and he, knowing about your background, the sides he wants, thinking about going to sea, would you be enthusiastic about that?
If my son came to me at 17 or 18 and said he wanted to go to sea, would I be enthusiastic? Yes. You know, there is risk in everything we do in life, but experiences like that are irreplaceable, and they're increasingly difficult to come by. We offer some of those kinds of programs here at the Seaport Museum. They've had a profound impact on my life. If my son decides he wants to go to sea, he will go with my blessing. You know, it's not lost on me that I was his age when my dad worked at the Mystic Seaport Museum, and he is now his age when his dad works at the South Street Seaport Museum. I think he's got a great opportunity here too, in that he gets to grow up around this place. It is a magical place here at the South Street Seaport, and there's so much more that's going to happen here in the near future. It's a really exciting time for me to be here and for him to be here. This moment, you know, in the latter half of 2015, for the South Street Seaport as a place, and just to say clearly what that is, there are few places in New York as vital to New York being what it is as the South Street Seaport. And we here who are working on the museum's effort at being a voice and an interpreter of that story are all feeling privileged, frankly, to be a part of an effort at keeping the light on something that is an irreplaceable gem for New York. New York, like many other great cities, is a city built on its harbors, and the place in which that happened here in New York is the South Street Seaport. It is still 19th century scale. If you walk across the Brooklyn Bridge and look over at the Seaport, you see all things that are 4, 5, and 6 stories tall. And it's in stark contrast to the financial district around it, which grew because of the South Street Seaport. It is such an important and pivotal and really special and magical time right now here in the South Street Seaport, and I feel so grateful to be a part of it, and to be a part of an organization like the museum with so many people who believe in what we're doing, from staff to members to volunteers to our friends in city government, elected officials, the people who live here in the district. And I think this is the moment. This is the moment for the Seaport Museum and for the Seaport, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Is there any